The first-class cabin was a world of quiet luxury, a space where privilege and status were on full display. Every seat was occupied, every overhead bin packed with sleek leather carry-ons and designer bags. The scent of expensive cologne mingled with freshly brewed coffee, creating an air of sophistication and exclusivity. Men in tailored suits sat with their eyes glued to stock market updates on their phones, their fingers occasionally tapping away at urgent emails. Women, dressed in elegant yet business-appropriate attire, either skimmed through reports or scrolled absently through social media, their expressions calm and composed. This was not just a section of the plane. It was an unspoken club where people exuded wealth, importance, and the relentless pursuit of success. Richard Dunn fit in perfectly. He settled into his window seat with an exhale, loosening his tie as the weight of the past 3 days hung heavily on his shoulders. The meetings had been exhausting, filled with clients who demanded the impossible while offering the bare minimum in return. Negotiations had stalled, projects had remained in limbo, and now, at the end of it all, this flight home to Tampa was his only reprieve. He looked forward to these few hours of uninterrupted silence, a rare moment where he didn't have to put on a performance or fight for the next big deal. He leaned back, savoring the comfort of the plush leather seat, already anticipating the first sip of complimentary champagne that would take the edge off his fatigue. This was the kind of space where Richard felt at home. A domain earned through hard work, relentless ambition, and years of clawing his way up the corporate ladder. He understood the unspoken rules of this world, the way first-class passengers carried themselves, the subtle nods of acknowledgement between those who belonged, the mutual respect that came with shared success. And then, she arrived. At first glance, she was unremarkable. Young, maybe mid to late 20s, neatly dressed but without any visible signs of wealth or status. A simple black blazer over a white blouse, no flashy jewelry, no designer handbag, nothing that immediately marked her as someone accustomed to this level of travel. Her long blonde hair was pinned back in a way that was both effortless and professional, and in her hands she carried nothing but a slim tablet, which she powered on the moment she sat down, without so much as glancing in his direction. Richard's eyes flicked toward her briefly before dismissing her. He had seen this type before. Trust fund kids who booked first class just because they could, treating luxury as if it were their birthright rather than something earned. He smirked slightly to himself, shaking his head at the thought. "Must be nice," he muttered under his breath, sinking further into his seat. With a sigh, he shut his eyes for a brief moment, content in his assumption that he understood exactly who she was, never once considering that his perception might be entirely wrong. Richard barely acknowledged the young woman as she slid into the seat beside him, her movements smooth and deliberate, her presence barely disrupting the carefully curated atmosphere of the first-class cabin. She was dressed neatly, but without ostentation. A black blazer over a white blouse, tailored but not extravagant, the kind of outfit that suggested professionalism without screaming wealth. There was no designer handbag resting at her feet, no ostentatious jewelry catching the light, nothing that indicated she belonged among the high-powered executives and seasoned business travelers filling the surrounding seats. Instead, she carried only a sleek, slim tablet, which she powered on almost immediately, her eyes scanning the screen with quiet focus. Richard watched her out of the corner of his eye, not out of interest but out of habit, his mind already slotting her into a familiar category. Another privileged 20-something, coasting through life on the back of family money, using first-class tickets the way others might use subway passes, casually, thoughtlessly, as if the world simply bent to her whims. He had encountered enough of her type before, young professionals who dressed the part but had never had to fight for a seat at the table, who had never struggled to make ends meet or felt the sting of rejection. Unlike them, Richard had earned his place in rooms like these. Every deal, every client, every hour spent clawing his way up the corporate hierarchy had led him here, to a life where first class was no longer a luxury but an expectation. And yet, here she was, sliding effortlessly into a world she hadn't worked for, her expression one of quiet disinterest, as if she had nothing to prove. Richard exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but something about her casual ease irritated him. He decided to test the waters just a little. Daddy's money, huh? First class for a weekend getaway, he murmured, his voice laced with amused condescension. He expected a reaction, a flicker of embarrassment, a defensive remark, maybe even a smug confirmation. Instead, she merely glanced at him, her expression neutral, unreadable. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, her tone so dispassionate it was almost dismissive. Richard chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if the joke was obvious. "It's just funny," he continued, leaning back into his seat. "Some people work their whole lives to afford a seat like this, and others just get handed it on a silver platter." He knew the script. This was usually the part where the other person either laughed along awkwardly, eager to prove they weren't some entitled brat, or snapped back defensively, insisting that they too had worked hard. But she did neither. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment, offering a small, polite smile, nothing amused, nothing offended, just a measured acknowledgement of his words, before she turned back to her tablet without a single further response. That unsettled him. He wasn't sure why, but something about her reaction, or rather, her lack of one, threw him off balance. People usually had a response when Richard spoke. They either agreed with him, challenged him, or attempted to justify themselves. That was how the world worked. But this woman, this Karoline Leavitt, simply refused to engage. It was as if he was nothing more than background noise, an unimportant footnote in her evening that irked him more than he cared to admit. A flight attendant passed by offering champagne. Richard took his glass without hesitation. When she turned to Karoline, however, the woman shook her head. "Not a champagne fan?" he asked, feigning casual curiosity. "I have work to do," she replied simply, her attention never wavering from her screen. He scoffed lightly, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Work, sure." Still, she ignored him. The hum of conversation around them barely registered as Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails, but every so often his gaze drifted toward her tablet. The documents, the structured notes, they weren't the kind of mindless entertainment he had expected. She wasn't browsing shopping websites or flipping through some vapid influencer's Instagram feed. She was working. And not just in a performative way, but with the kind of intent and concentration that suggested genuine purpose. Still, he wasn't convinced. He had seen plenty of people pretend to be busy, to play the role of a dedicated professional when, in reality, they had little to show for it. He was ready to dismiss her again, to return to the comfort of his own assumptions, when a flight attendant stopped beside them and changed everything. "Miss Leavitt, it's an honor to have you on board," the woman said with quiet admiration. Richard blinked. He turned his head just in time to see Karoline look up, offering the attendant a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you," she replied with practiced grace. The attendant hesitated, then added, "I just wanted to say, your last speech, really powerful. A lot of us respect what you're doing." Richard frowned. Speech? What speech? But Karoline only nodded in appreciation, acknowledging the words without elaborating. Richard, however, felt a nagging sensation creep into his chest. Something about that name, Leavitt, tugged at the edges of his memory. He had heard it before, somewhere, but he couldn't quite place it. He should have recognized it immediately. He should have known. But he didn't, and for the first time since she sat down beside him, he started to feel uneasy. Richard exhaled sharply, adjusting his grip on the armrest as he processed the flight attendant's words. "Miss Leavitt, it's an honor to have you on board." That phrase alone should have been enough to give him pause, but what truly unsettled him was Karoline's response, calm, composed, as if being recognized and respected was an everyday occurrence for her. She had merely nodded, offering a small smile before returning to her work, unaffected by the weight of the compliment. That wasn't the behavior of a spoiled rich kid playing pretend. That wasn't the response of someone who had been handed everything in life. No, there was something else here, something that didn't fit the picture he had so confidently painted. But Richard wasn't ready to admit he was wrong. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, watching her through narrowed eyes, still convinced that somehow he had figured her out. His mind clung stubbornly to the idea that she was just another entitled 20-something with connections that paved the way for her success. Maybe she was the daughter of a politician, a media mogul, or some Silicon Valley billionaire. That would explain the deference, the recognition, the admiration in the flight attendant's voice. But it didn't explain the way she carried herself, the quiet self-assurance, the lack of arrogance, the unwavering focus on her work. If she was the privileged type, he suspected, why wasn't she flaunting it? Why wasn't she relishing the attention? Richard was used to reading people. In his world, perception was everything. He had built his career on quick assessments, on knowing who mattered in a room and who didn't. He could tell within minutes whether someone was worth his time. It was an instinct sharpened over years of negotiation, business deals, and high-stakes networking. And yet, as he sat there beside Karoline Leavitt, he found himself second-guessing. That irritated him. He wasn't wrong. He couldn't be wrong. He decided to double down. "So," he said, his voice carrying just enough curiosity to seem casual. "You must travel a lot, huh?" Karoline glanced up from her tablet, offering him the same unreadable expression she had given before. "I do," she said simply. Richard nodded as if that confirmed something. "Makes sense," he continued. "First class must feel like a second home." He smirked slightly, but this time there was an edge to it. "Nice when you don't have to worry about the cost, right?" Again, he expected some kind of reaction. Offense, irritation, amusement, but Karoline simply met his gaze with a steady calmness that made him uncomfortable. "I wouldn't say that," she replied, her tone neutral, offering nothing for him to latch onto. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't used to people like her. He was used to people who either craved approval or recoiled under scrutiny. But she did neither. Instead, she just existed, unbothered, unimpressed, uninterested in proving anything to him. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Before he could push further, another voice entered the conversation. "Excuse me," the businessman across the aisle spoke up, his salt and pepper hair slightly disheveled from hours of travel. "But aren't you Karoline Leavitt?" Richard stiffened, watching as Karoline turned to the man, offering him a polite nod. "Yes, I am." The businessman's expression shifted, a mix of recognition and genuine respect. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You were the White House press secretary, weren't you?" Richard's stomach dropped. Press secretary? He barely had time to process before the businessman continued, his tone carrying the weight of admiration. "I followed your career, your interviews, the way you handled the media. Impressive stuff. And young, too. You've made quite a name for yourself." Karoline responded with the same calm professionalism, acknowledging the compliment but not indulging in it. "That's kind of you to say. I just try to do my job well." Richard's mouth had gone dry. He kept his eyes locked on his phone screen, pretending to read an email, but the words blurred together into meaningless symbols. He could feel the shift in the air around him, the subtle way the passengers nearby had taken notice. The murmurs had already begun. "That's Karoline Leavitt. I knew I recognized her. She's brilliant. Handled those press briefings like a pro." Richard swallowed hard. The weight of his earlier words crashed down on him with humiliating force. He had made a snide comment about daddy's money to a woman who had stood behind a White House podium, feeling some of the most ruthless questions in politics. He had assumed she was another spoiled rich kid when in reality she had worked in one of the most high-pressure roles in the country. And the worst part, she had let him. She hadn't corrected him, she hadn't defended herself, she hadn't even given him the satisfaction of proving him wrong. She had just let him talk, let him walk himself right into his own ignorance. Across the aisle, the businessman chuckled, shaking his head. "You probably get recognized all the time," he said. "Must be exhausting dealing with public perception." Karoline offered a knowing smile. "It has its moments." Richard forced himself to speak, though his voice was noticeably tighter than before. "So, White House press secretary, huh?" He attempted a casual chuckle. "Didn't realize." Karoline turned to him, her expression as composed as ever. "You didn't ask. It wasn't a jab. It wasn't even said with malice. Just a simple fact. But it landed like a slap." Richard cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "I guess I made a bit of an assumption earlier." Karoline didn't say anything. She didn't reassure him. She didn't offer him a way out of his embarrassment. She just waited. Richard exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just that, you know." "You don't exactly look like—" He hesitated, realizing too late that he had started a sentence he didn't know how to finish. Karoline arched an eyebrow, her expression calm but unwavering. "That I didn't belong here?" Richard's stomach twisted. He could feel the businessman watching with thinly veiled amusement. The murmurs around them had quieted, but people were still listening, still watching. The spotlight was on him now, and it made the space around him feel unbearably tight. He exhaled sharply, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "No, nothing like that. Just that I must have had someone else pay for my seat." Karoline held his gaze, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it. Then, with a quiet finality, she finished his sentence for him. "Because people like me don't earn their way here." Richard felt heat creep up his neck. She had let him walk into this moment completely on his own, giving him every opportunity to stop talking. And now she was simply standing at the exit, waiting to see how he'd get himself out. For the first time in a long time, Richard Dunn had no idea what to say. Richard sat frozen in his seat, the weight of his mistake settling heavily in his chest. The realization that he had completely misjudged Karoline Leavitt was sinking in fast, and the whispers from nearby passengers only amplified his discomfort. He had spent the past several minutes crafting a false narrative in his head, convinced that the woman beside him was nothing more than a privileged, entitled rich girl who had never had to work for anything in her life. And yet, the truth had arrived like a wrecking ball, shattering his assumptions with ruthless efficiency. She wasn't some trust fund kid coasting through life on her family's wealth. She was the youngest White House press secretary in history, a woman who had stood at one of the most scrutinized podiums in the world, fielding tough questions from seasoned political journalists. She had navigated high-pressure situations that would have left lesser people crumbling, and yet she had sat there, listening to him spew condescending remarks without ever once feeling the need to correct him. That, more than anything, unsettled him the most. The businessman across the aisle seemed to enjoy the moment, his smirk barely hidden behind the rim of his reading glasses. "You really don't know who you're sitting next to, do you?" he said with an amused chuckle. Richard clenched his jaw, hating the way the question made him feel like a fool. The worst part was, he had heard the name Karoline Leavitt before. Somewhere, in passing, on the news, maybe in a political debate he hadn't paid much attention to. He prided himself on keeping up with major figures in business and politics, yet somehow he had failed to recognize her when she was sitting right next to him. His earlier arrogance now felt like a stone pressing against his chest. He glanced at Karoline, who remained unbothered, focused on her tablet as though none of this had even fazed her. That irritated him more than anything. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone he had openly disrespected. He wanted her to react, to call him out, to show some sign that she had been offended, but she didn't. She just let the silence hang between them, giving him no way to escape his own embarrassment. The businessman, still clearly enjoying the moment, leaned in slightly, as if he couldn't resist twisting the knife a little deeper. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just the White House press secretary, he continued. She was the youngest to ever hold that position. You don't land a job like that because someone hands it to you. You earn it. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the words land like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life believing that success was something you had to claw your way toward. He had told himself that he could always tell who had worked for their place in the world and who had simply inherited it. And yet, he had failed spectacularly in this case. His mind raced, trying to find something, anything, to salvage what little dignity he had left. "I followed your career," the businessman added, clearly not finished. "You handled some of the most brutal press briefings I've ever seen. The way you managed the media, the way you held your ground, that's not something you fake. That's talent. That's discipline. And if I remember correctly—" He paused, smiling as if savoring the moment. "She didn't come from money, no silver spoon, no handouts, just hard work." Richard felt his throat tighten. His earlier words, his smug little remarks about daddy's money and first class for a weekend getaway, now echoed in his mind, each one more humiliating than the last. He had accused her of privilege, when in reality, she had worked in one of the most demanding roles in the country. And the worst part? She had let him. She hadn't tried to defend herself, hadn't corrected him, hadn't even thrown her title in his face. She had just let him walk himself into his own ignorance, watching as he fell deeper into his assumptions without ever needing to lift a finger. That, more than anything, made him feel small. Richard exhaled, forcing a dry chuckle as he tried to recover. "Well, I guess I spoke too soon," he muttered, his voice noticeably tighter than before. Karoline finally turned to him, her gaze as calm and unreadable as ever. "You did," she said simply. Nothing more. No reassurance, no attempt to soften the blow, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement of the truth. Richard shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "It's just that, you don't exactly look like—" He hesitated, realizing mid-sentence that he had trapped himself once again. Karoline arched an eyebrow, waiting. "Like what?" she asked, her voice steady. Richard forced another weak laugh, trying to find his way out of the hole he had dug himself into. "I mean, I just assumed—" Karoline didn't let him finish. "That I didn't belong here?" Her words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight that made his stomach twist. He had been called out, but not in a dramatic, accusatory way, just in a way that left no room for argument. The businessman across the aisle chuckled again, shaking his head. "You know, Dunn, it takes a special kind of arrogance to assume you know a person just by looking at them." Richard bristled slightly but said nothing. He knew there was no talking his way out of this one. More murmurs rippled through the cabin as other passengers exchanged knowing glances. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel the weight of their silent judgment. It wasn't an outright humiliation, but it was close enough. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly, willing the conversation to die down. He needed to move past this. He needed to regain some sense of composure. The flight attendant returned, and Richard immediately noticed the shift in her demeanor. Before, she had smiled at him, with the same polite warmth she offered to all first-class passengers. Now, her expression was more reserved, her tone more neutral. "Mr. Dunn, would you like another drink?" she asked, professional but noticeably cooler than before. Richard hesitated. Before all of this, he would have answered without thinking, but now he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin, waiting for his response. He shook his head. "No, I'm good," he muttered. The flight attendant nodded, then turned to Karoline, and this time her smile was genuine. "Ms. Leavitt, can I get you anything?" Karoline gave a small, polite shake of her head. "I'm fine, but thank you." The subtle difference in treatment wasn't lost on Richard. Before, he had felt like the dominant presence in their row, the kind of man people deferred to. But now, that dynamic had shifted, and he wasn't used to being on the other side of it. The businessman smirked behind his reading glasses, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Richard exhaled, glancing at his watch. They still had over an hour left in the flight. An hour trapped in his own embarrassment, surrounded by people who had just watched him misjudge someone in real time. The silence between him and Karoline stretched, but this time, it wasn't comfortable. It pressed against him, making the space between them feel smaller, the air heavier. For the first time in a long time, Richard Dunn didn't feel like he belonged. Richard sat stiffly in his seat, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him like an invisible force. The cabin that had once felt like his domain, a space where he belonged, where people like him were meant to be, now felt impossibly small, the air thick with the remnants of his arrogance. His fingers drummed absently against the armrest, his mind racing as he replayed every word he had said to Karoline Leavitt, every smug assumption, every misplaced judgment. He had walked into this conversation thinking he understood exactly who she was, believing he could read her the way he had read countless others throughout his career. But now, with the full weight of his mistakes settling in, he realized just how wrong he had been. Worse than that, everyone around him had witnessed it. The businessman across the aisle had watched him fumble his way into embarrassment with thinly veiled amusement. The murmurs from nearby passengers hadn't gone unnoticed, their hushed voices carrying the unmistakable tone of people who had just seen someone make a fool of themselves. And then there was the flight attendant. Her subtle shift in demeanor when she had spoken to him, the slight cooling of her once warm profession. Before, he had been a man who commanded a certain presence in a space like this. someone who was treated with deference, respect, and maybe even a little admiration. Now, he was just another guy who had made a fool of himself in front of people who would remember it long after the flight had landed. But the worst part of it all, the part that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite shake, was Karoline. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't smirked, hadn't thrown his words back at him, hadn't even allowed herself the satisfaction of watching him squirm. She had simply let the moment unfold, giving him every opportunity to stop talking before he embarrassed himself further. And now she had returned her attention to her tablet as if nothing had happened, as if his presence beside her was entirely inconsequential. That, more than anything, stung. If she had fought back, if she had corrected him the moment he made his ignorant comments, he could have defended himself, he could have argued, could have dismissed her as someone overly sensitive or unwilling to take a joke. But she hadn't given him that out. Instead, she had done something far worse. She had let him bury himself in his own arrogance, had let him sit in the discomfort of his own words, and now she was simply moving on. Because, in the grand scheme of things, his opinion of her had never mattered to begin with. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples as he tried to shake the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He had built his career on confidence, on control, on always being the person in the room who knew what was going on. He was rarely the one caught off guard, rarely the one who miscalculated, and yet here he was, sitting next to a woman he had completely underestimated, forced to reckon with the fact that his instincts, the very thing he had spent years perfecting, had failed him spectacularly. He cleared his throat, forcing a casual chuckle, though even he could hear the strain in it. "So," he said, glancing sideways at Karoline, "White House press secretary, huh? That's She didn't look up from her tablet. "You didn't ask," she replied simply. The words weren't sharp, but they carried weight. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I guess I didn't." He hesitated, searching for something, anything, to fill the silence between them, to regain even a sliver of the confidence he had walked onto this plane with. I guess I made a bit of an assumption earlier." Karoline finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You did." She didn't soften it, didn't reassure him, didn't offer him a way out of his own embarrassment. She simply stated the fact, leaving him to sit with it. Richard let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't used to being wrong, and he certainly wasn't used to being called out on it in a way that left him with no room to argue. He had spent years trusting his ability to read people, to assess them within moments, to decide who was worth his time and who wasn't. And yet, here he was, realizing, too late, that he had completely misjudged the most accomplished person in the room. The businessman across the aisle smirked behind his magazine, clearly still enjoying the show. Richard exhaled sharply, glancing at his watch. There was still more than an hour left in the flight, an hour trapped in the discomfort of his own realization, surrounded by people who had seen him stumble. The silence between him and Karoline stretched, but this time it wasn't the easy, dismissive silence of before. Now it was thick, charged with the weight of everything that had just transpired. Richard felt it pressing against him, making the space between them feel smaller, the air heavier. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. Richard sat in his seat, staring blankly at the screen of his phone, but he wasn't really reading anything. His mind was still spinning, replaying everything that had just unfolded, the weight of his mistake settling deeper with each passing moment. He had spent years believing that he could read people at a glance, that he could take one look at someone and know exactly who they were, where they came from, and what they had done to get there. It was an instinct he had prided himself on, something he considered a skill, a necessary tool in the world of business. And yet, here he was, sitting next to a woman he had completely misjudged, his assumptions crumbling under the weight of reality. Karoline Leavitt wasn't a trust fund kid playing professional. She wasn't a rich girl spending her father's money. She wasn't anything he had assumed her to be. She was one of the youngest people to ever hold one of the most high-pressure jobs in the country, someone who had built her career not on privilege but on skill, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of purpose. And she had let him make a fool of himself without lifting a finger. Richard shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, as if the simple act could somehow rid him of the discomfort pressing against his chest. He wanted to move past this, to shake off the feeling of embarrassment clinging to him, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Karoline. This was about all the people he had misjudged before her. How many times had he walked into a room and dismissed someone based on how they looked? How many times had he assumed he knew a person's story before they even opened their mouth? How many people had he written off simply because they didn't fit into the narrow mold of what he thought success should look like? He had spent years believing that he was good at reading people, but now, sitting here, he wasn't so sure. Maybe he had been wrong about more than just Karoline. Maybe he had been wrong about a lot of things. He exhaled sharply, glancing at her again. She was still focused on her tablet, completely unfazed, as if their earlier exchange had already been forgotten. But Richard hadn't forgotten. He couldn't. The lesson was sitting too heavily on his shoulders, forcing him to acknowledge something he had spent years avoiding. He wasn't as perceptive as he thought he was. He had been so quick to put Karoline into a box that he hadn't even considered the possibility that he might be wrong. And the worst part? He had done it without thinking. It had been automatic, instinctual, as natural as breathing. The moment he had seen her, his mind had filled in the blanks, had crafted a story that fit the narrative he expected. It wasn't until the truth had been dropped on him like a bomb that he had even questioned his own judgment. And that terrified him. Because if he had been wrong about Karoline, how many other people had he been wrong about? How many opportunities had he missed? How many valuable connections had he discarded? How many brilliant minds had he overlooked because they didn't look the way he thought success should look? He let out a breath, running a hand down his face. He didn't like this feeling. The feeling of being exposed, of realizing that the way he had moved through the world might have been fundamentally flawed. He wanted to push it away, to bury it, to pretend it didn't matter. But it did matter, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just brushing off his mistake and moving on. He was sitting with it, feeling the full weight of it, letting it sink in, and it was uncomfortable. Finally, he couldn't take the silence anymore. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Karoline looked up, her expression unreadable. "Tired of what?" He gestured vaguely, feeling strangely self-conscious. "People assuming things about you, judging you before they even know who you are." She studied him for a moment before leaning back slightly in her seat. "It used to bother me," she admitted. "When I was younger, I felt like I had to prove myself every time I walked into a room. But then I realized," she paused, glancing toward the window for a brief second before returning her gaze to him, "the people who underestimate me don't get to decide what I—" Richard felt those words settle in his chest like a stone. He had spent his entire career believing that perception was everything, that first impressions mattered more than anything else. He had built a life around the idea that success had a certain look, a certain feel, a certain presence. But Karoline didn't fit into any of those preconceived notions, and yet she had accomplished more than most people could ever dream of. She hadn't needed to prove herself to him. She hadn't needed his validation. She had simply let the truth speak for itself, and that was what made him so uncomfortable, because it forced him to confront the possibility that his entire way of seeing the world had been flawed. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Must be nice," he muttered, almost to himself. Karoline tilted her head slightly. "What must be nice?" He let out a short breath, his lips pressing into a thin line. "To be that sure of yourself." She considered that for a moment, then offered a small, almost knowing smile. "It takes time." Richard looked away, staring at the seat in front of him. The businessman across the aisle had returned to his magazine, but Richard knew he had been listening. The entire cabin had taken on that quiet, loaded energy that came when something unspoken had been settled. He wasn't going to win this one, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to. The flight attendant passed by again, and this time Richard caught the way she glanced at him, just briefly, just enough to let him know that whatever impression he had walked onto this plane with was long gone. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it was time for him to start seeing people differently. Maybe it was time for him to start asking better questions before filling in the blanks. Because at the end of the day, The real lesson wasn't about Karoline Leavitt. It was about all the people he had misjudged before her, and now, for the first time in a long time, he was willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, he had a lot more to learn. As the flight neared its descent, Richard sat quietly, his mind still tangled in the events of the past couple of hours. The hum of the cabin had settled back into a steady rhythm, conversations resuming, passengers returning to their books, screens, and quiet thoughts. But Richard couldn't shake the weight sitting heavily in his chest. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of his carefully crafted worldview. He had spent his entire career believing that he understood people, that he could assess a person's worth in a matter of seconds based on the way they dressed, carried themselves, spoke, and interacted. He had trusted that instinct, had relied on it to navigate boardrooms, close deals, and establish himself as a man who belonged in first-class cabins, exclusive clubs, and high-stakes negotiations. But today, that instinct had failed him, spectacularly. Karoline Leavitt had walked onto this plane, taken the seat beside him, and, without saying much at all, had managed to upend everything he thought he knew about people. She hadn't argued with him, hadn't tried to prove herself, hadn't even corrected his ignorant assumptions. She had simply let him fall into his own trap, allowing his words to dig a deeper and deeper hole until he had no choice but to face the truth. And the truth was, he had been wrong. Not just about her, but about the way he had been seeing the world. How many times had he written someone off because they didn't fit his expectations? How many opportunities had he dismissed because he assumed he already knew the outcome? How many people had he overlooked, underestimated, or disrespected because of his own unchecked biases? The realization sat heavy on his shoulders. He glanced at Karoline again, watching as she calmly reviewed the documents on her tablet, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the screen. She wasn't thinking about him anymore. She had already moved on. That, more than anything, told him everything he needed to know about her. She wasn't the kind of person who needed validation, who sought approval from people like him. She had earned her place in the world through sheer skill, intelligence, and resilience, and she didn't need to explain that to anyone. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. He hated feeling like the fool, hated being the last one in the room to understand something, but there was no escaping it now. He had spent the entire flight thinking he was the most important person in this row, only to realize that he had been in the presence of someone far more remarkable the entire time. As the plane began its descent, he turned to her one last time, hesitating before he spoke. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice quieter than before, "I really am sorry." Karoline looked up, meeting his gaze with an unreadable expression. For a second, he wasn't sure if she was going to respond, but then she gave a small nod. "I know." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't dismissive either. It was simply the truth. And, strangely, that was enough. They stood up as the plane reached the gate, retrieving their bags from the overhead compartment. As Richard stepped aside to let Karoline into the aisle, he noticed the way the businessman across from them gave her a respectful nod, the way the flight attendant smiled warmly and thanked her again, the way other passengers subtly glanced at her with recognition now that they knew who she was. She had never needed to announce herself. Her presence alone had commanded the respect that he had assumed was his by default. Richard had spent years thinking that success looked a certain way, that he could spot value in a person within moments, but today had proven otherwise. Maybe he didn't know as much as he thought. Maybe he had a lot more to learn. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start seeing people for who they really were instead of who he assumed them to be. As they reached the terminal, passengers began scattering in different directions, heading toward baggage claim, exits, and connecting flights. Karoline walked with purpose, knowing exactly where she was going, both in the airport and in life. Richard hesitated, watching her go, then called out, "Leavitt!" She stopped, turning back toward him, waiting. Not impatient, not irritated, just waiting. Richard took a step forward, exhaling. "Look, I know we already did the whole apology thing, but I meant it." He hesitated before continuing. "I was wrong, and not just about you. About a lot of things." Karoline studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you." Richard huffed out a small laugh, shaking his head. I don't even know why I said it in the first place, that daddy's money line, he sighed. It was like instinct. The moment I saw you, my brain filled in the blanks and I just went with it. Karoline crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. And now? He let out a slow breath, glancing around the bustling terminal before meeting her eyes again. Now, I think I need to start asking better questions before I fill in the blanks. A small smile touched her lips. Not smug, not gloating, just understanding. That's a good place to start. She turned toward the exit, but Richard called out again. Hey, can I ask you one more thing? She glanced back. Go for it. You ever misjudge people? Karoline thought about that for a second, then nodded. Of course, everyone does. And when that happens, he asked, what do you do? She gave him a knowing look, her answer simple but firm. I try to be better next time. With that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard stood there for a moment, watching her go, then exhaled, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. He had spent years convincing himself that he knew how the world worked, that he could take one look at someone and know their story. But today had proven otherwise. Maybe he had been wrong more times than he cared to admit. Maybe he had been missing more than he realized. As he made his way through the terminal, he found himself thinking about all the people he had judged before this, all the stories he had written in his head before ever hearing a word spoken. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just brushing off the realization. He was sitting with it, letting it settle, letting it change him. Because at the end of the day, the real lesson wasn't about Karoline Leavitt. It was about everyone else. About every person he had underestimated, every opportunity he had overlooked, every judgment he had made without question. If you've ever found yourself making quick assumptions about someone, ask yourself, how much of that is actually true? How often do we assume we know someone's story without ever hearing it? Maybe it's time to slow down and listen. You never know who you're sitting next to. In life, we often make quick judgments about others based on appearances or preconceived notions. The story of Richard Dunn and Karoline Leavitt serves as a powerful reminder that truly understanding a person goes beyond surface-level assumptions. This lesson is especially relevant for older adults who have witnessed decades of societal and cultural changes. While age brings wisdom and experience, it can also reinforce biases that may no longer be valid. However, time evolves and so do people. Someone may not be who we assume them to be, and every person carries a story far more complex than what meets the eye. The most important takeaway from this story is the value of humility and the willingness to listen. Instead of rushing to judge, we should take the time to understand a person through their words, actions, and contributions. Sometimes, a person's silence does not indicate a lack of competence, but rather a quiet confidence that does not seek validation. This serves as a reminder that respect should not be reserved only for those who appear successful or wealthy, but should extend to everyone, regardless of their background. When we open ourselves to listening and understanding, we not only gain a broader perspective on the world, but also foster deeper and more meaningful connections in life. Above all, learning and growth have no age limit. It is never too late to change the way we see others and, in turn, the way we see ourselves.